Continuing in Voss's Biblical Theology, Chapter 5, the Noachian Revelation and the development leading up to it. Continuing, the second section, Genesis 9, 1 to 7, relates the ordinances instituted in order to make possible and safeguard this program of forbearance. These ordinances refer to the propagation of life, the protection of life from animals and men both, and the sustenance of life. What relates to the sustenance of life has been inserted into the promise of protection of life from animals because the permission of animal food for better sustenance naturally attached itself to this. In order to understand these measures, we must clearly visualize the reduced state of the human race in which the flood had resulted. Hence, the echo of some of the original creative ordinances is heard here. The importance of this may be inferred from its double occurrence, first in verse 1 and then again in verse 7. As to the protection of human life from animals, verse 2 provides for the subjection of the animals to man. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, with all wherewith the ground teemeth, and all the fishes of the sea, into your hand are they delivered. To this is added in verse 5, and surely the blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it. Originally, there was a supremacy of man, Genesis 1, 26 and 28. But as instituted at creation, this was of the nature of a voluntary submission. This may be seen from the eschatological pictures given of it by the prophets on the principles of a return of paradise at the end, Isaiah 11, 6 to 8. In the state of sin, the result is obtained by fear and dread instilled into the animals. And God promises to avenge man where devouring animals destroy his life. Your blood of your lives will I require. It is not possible to tell with certainty how this law works itself out. It has been suggested that every species of carnivorous animals is doomed to ultimate extinction. Intercalated between these animals, between these references to hostile animals is the permission of animal food. The permission is qualified. But flesh with the life thereof and the blood thereof ye shall not eat. This being coupled with the promise of vengeance from animals reveals the point of view. Since the animals are not to devour man after a carnivorous fashion, man also is not to eat animals as wild beasts devour their living prey. He must show proper reverence for life as a sacred thing, of which God alone has the disposal, and for the use of which man is dependent on the permission of God. The Levitical law repeats this prohibition, but adds as another ground the fact that the blood comes upon the altar, which of course for the Old Testament makes the prohibition of blood eating absolute. Through failure to distinguish between the simple and the complicated motive, this practice of absolute abstention was continued in the church for many centuries. The so-called Decree of the Apostles, Acts 15:20, made the restraint obligatory for Gentile Christians, yet not because the thing was wrong in itself, but for the reason that no offense should be given to Jewish Christian brethren. The last point relates to the protection of human life from the assault of man and lays down the divine law for the punishment of murder. At the hand of man, even at the hand of every man's brother, will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Some, in order to evade the institution of the death penalty for murder, would understand these words as a mere prediction that murder is apt to be followed by blood vengeance under the lex talionis. that is to say, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This exegesis is made positively impossible by the added clause, for in the image of God made he man. The image of God and man can never furnish a motivation for the likelihood of the exaction of blood vengeance. The question remains what the image of God and man has to do with the infliction of the death penalty. Two answers have been given to this. According to the one, this clause explains why such an extraordinary power of taking away the life of another, man, can be conferred upon man's fellow creature. It is in virtue of the sovereignty of God, being part of the divine image laid upon him, that man can execute justice in capital matters. Others understand the clause as furnishing the reason why assault upon the life of man should meet with this extreme penalty. In life slain, it is the image of God, that is, the divine majesty, that is assaulted. The latter interpretation deserves the preference. Notice the difference that here the instrument for the execution of the divine ordinance is clearly indicated. By man shall his blood be shed, whereas in the case of retribution upon the animals, this aspect of the matter is left indefinite. Further, the ground for the institution of the penalty appears to be a twofold one. On the one hand, the larger context in which the ordinance occurs proves it to be a measure of protection for society. At the same time, the reference to the image of God shows that something still deeper underlies. It may well be questioned whether the former alone, and that without an explicit injunction from God, could ever justify the infliction of death from one man upon another. Purely utilitarian social considerations would be hardly sufficient here. They can come in as a secondary reason only after the matter has been put upon the high ground of the administration of justice sanctioned by God. The argument so frequently met with that capital punishment adds but a second murder to the first is an argument based either on total ignorance of the facts of Scripture or on open denial of the obligatory character of what the Bible teaches. How can that be characterized as a duplicated murder that professes to rest on the most explicit command of God, and over against which men have nothing to put except sentimental objections and an unproven theory about the meliorating efficacy of forms of discipline which from their very nature exclude the punishment of death? The last section is chapter 9, 8 to 17. God gives his promise the form of a berit through adding a solemn sign to it. This serves the purpose of bringing out the absolute sureness of the order instituted. Jeremiah 33:25 speaks in this sense of God's berit of day and night, that is, of the unfailing succession of these two. Perhaps, however, there is more here than a comparative introduction of the berit idea. An actual reference to the Noachian episode may be intended. This is certainly the case in Isaiah 54:9, where the Noachian berit stands in its infallibility as a type of the even greater perpetuity of the promise of God's oath of redemption. The promise to Noah has its limit in the eschatological crisis, which shall bring the earth to an end. But, though in that final catastrophe the mountains depart and the hills are removed, yet even then God's loving kindness shall not depart from Israel, nor the berit of his peace be removed. Verse 10. The representation with regard to the sign of the rainbow is anthropomorphic, but for that very reason more impressive than it could possibly be otherwise. The idea is not, as usually assumed, that by the bow man will be reminded of the divine promise, but that God himself, were it possible for him to forget, will by the sign himself be reminded of his oath. When I bring a cloud over the earth, it shall come to pass that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my berit. With the rainbow, it is as later on it was with circumcision. Both existed before, and at a certain time, the appointed time, were consecrated by God to serve as signs of his berit. The sign here is connected in its character with the ominous force of nature from which it pledges protection. It is produced against the background of the very clouds that had brought destruction to the earth. But it is produced upon these by rays of the sun, which, in the symbolism of Scripture, represent the divine grace. Chapter 6, the period between Noah and the great patriarchs. The points to be discussed here are 1. The prophetic deliverances of Noah with regard to his descendants. 2. The table of the nations. 3. The confusion of tongues. 4. The election of the Shemites. 1. The prophetic deliverances of Noah. Genesis 9:20-27. These prophecies are in the case of Canaan, Ham, a curse; in the case of Japheth and Shem, a blessing. The words must be regarded throughout as words of prophecy. Even paganism ascribes to such utterances a real influence to affect the persons concerned. This influence was conceived as magical, but in Scripture this is raised to the plane of inspired prophecy. Such prophecies in this early period represent the high water mark of the advancing tide of revelation. It will be observed that the basis for the distinction between cursing and blessing lay in the ethical sphere. The shameless sensuality of Ham, the modesty of Japheth and Shem, marked a difference in common morality. Nevertheless, it shaped in a most far-reaching manner the whole subsequent course of redemptive history. The supernatural process of redemption remains in contact with the natural development of the race. These influential traits were typical traits. They were the source of great racial dispositions. The event took place at a critical juncture where no significant event could fail to influence history for ages to come. The Old Testament recognizes that among the Canaanites, the same type of sin here cursed was the dominating trait of evil. The descriptions given in the Pentateuch leave no doubt as to this. Compare Leviticus 18:22 and Deuteronomy 12:29-32. Even among the ancients outside Israel, Japhethites, the sensual depravity and sexual life of Phoenicians and Carthaginians in particular had become proverbial. The question has been raised why, instead of Ham, who had committed the sin, Canaan, his son, is cursed. Some assume that Ham was the youngest son of Noah, and Canaan the youngest son of Ham. The underlying principle would then be that Ham is punished, and that son who sustains the same relation to him as he sustained to Noah. This would bring out the fact of its being a sin committed against his father. There would be nothing in this against the Old Testament law of retribution, for the Old Testament is not in such points so morbidly individualistic as we are apt to be. Especially in the earlier part of Old Testament revelation, the principle of generic solidarity is stressed. Compare Exodus 25:6, where the operation of the rule both in malam, that is, in evil, and in bonum partem, or in the good part, is affirmed. Later revelation, especially in Ezekiel, brought the closer working out of the problem involved. However, the facts of the genealogical relationship above assumed are subject to doubt. The usual sequence in which the names of Noah's sons are given is Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which indicates that Ham occupied the middle place. Nor is there any evidence for Canaan having been the youngest son of Ham. Youngest son in the Revised Version, verse 24, is not conclusive because the Hebrew word can be comparative as well as superlative, which would yield younger son, as in RV margin, assigning to Ham the middle place in the triad. Under these circumstances, it is best to adopt a modified form of the view proposed and to say, Ham was punished in one of his sons because he had sinned against his father, and he was punished in that particular son because Canaan most strongly reproduced Ham's sensual character. It should be noticed that not all the descendants of Ham are cursed, but only the Canaanites. The others receive neither curse nor blessing. A comment here by pointing out that the curse is specifically delimited to the Canaanites um, would stand against some of these Aryanized interpretations by which essentially African peoples are inherently under this Hamite curse. Continuing. Finally, we must, in passing, touch upon the critical solution of the problem in hand. The divisive critics say that in the original version of the story, the three sons of Noah were Shem, Japheth, and Canaan, and that this was afterwards changed to the present enumeration. This, of course, requires the deletion of the words Ham, the father of, in verse 22, and further of the words Ham is the father of Canaan, in verse 18. This, of course, these words were subsequently added according to this theory when the family relationship of Noah were altered. The curse upon Canaan consists in his being degraded to servitude to his brethren. This recurs as a refrain in the sequel to the blessings of Japheth and Shem. The second member of the prophecy relates to Shem. Here, the use of the name Jehovah seems significant. In point of fact, this name contains in itself the blessing bestowed upon Shem. It lies in this, that God, in the capacity of Jehovah, the God of redemption, gives himself to this part of the race for religious possession and enjoyment. It is a Berit formula, meaning far more than the Shemites will worship far more than that the Shemites will worship Jehovah. This is the first time in Scripture that God is called the God of some particular group of mankind. It is so extraordinary a blessing as to inspire the patriarch to the utterance of a doxology. Blessed be Jehovah, the God of Shem. Resolved into its explicit meaning, it would read, Blessed be Jehovah because he is willing to be the God of Shem. The third member of the prophecy is of more uncertain interpretation. It reads, God enlarge Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem. One point of uncertainty is the meaning of the verb yaft, a play on the sound of the name Japhet. Is this to be taken locally or metaphorically? The former makes it refer to extension of territory. The latter understands it of enlargement, that is, increase of prosperity. A second point of uncertainty relates to the question, who is the subject of the clause, let him dwell? Is this meant of God or of Japhet? The two questions are interlinked. If the subject of the second clause be Japhet, then it is but natural to understand the first clause of enlargement of territory. To dwell in the tents of some tribe or people is a common way for describing conquest of one tribe by another. For Japhet to dwell in the tents of Shem implies conquest of Shemitic territory by Japhethites. On the other hand, if him in let him dwell relates to God, then we should have to paraphrase as follows. May God give large prosperity to Japhet, but let him bestow upon Shem what far transcends all such temporal blessedness, Let him, that is God, dwell in the tents of Shem. In that case, a contrast is drawn between the objective gifts bestowed upon the Japhethites and the personal self-communication of God upon the Shemites. The territorial rendering of enlarge, carrying with it the reference of him to Japhet, deserves the preference. The use of the name Elohim favors it, since it is not of Elohim but of Jehovah that such a gracious indwelling is predicated. Understanding it of Japhethites overrunning Shemitic lands, we should not, however, allegorize the statement as though a spiritual dwelling together between Shemites and Japhethites were referred to. A real political conquest is intended, but ultimately such physical conquest will have for its result the coming of a religious blessing to Japhet. Occupying the tents of Shem, he will find the God of Shem, the God of redemption and of revelation there. The prophecy, both in its proximate political import and as to its ultimate spiritual consequences, was fulfilled through the subjugating of Shemitic territory by the Greeks and Romans. For this blessing became one of the most potent factors in the spread of the true religion over the earth. Delitzsch strikingly remarks, "We are all Japhethites dwelling in the tents of Shem." Parenthetically, I also think of how Egypt, by taking under its wing the, at least Joseph, brought upon itself salvation. 2. The Table of the Nations. As a piece of word revelation, this does not properly belong to the period with which we are dealing. It is something incorporated into the Mosaic account from whatever source derived. Nevertheless, insofar as it throws backward its light upon the procedure of God at the post-Diluvian time, we are justified in using it for the elucidation of the events of the latter. The table anticipates somewhat in that it speaks of nations, families, tongues, the origin of which distinction is not described till chapter 11. The table of the Shemites comes last, although genealogically this was not the sequence to be expected, which proves that this is not a piece of secular genealogy. It is a chapter belonging to the genealogy of redemption. The idea embodied in the table is that, while for the proximate future the Shemites will constitute the race of redemption, yet the other nations are by no means permanently dismissed from the field of sacred history. Their names are registered to express the principle that in the fullness of time the divine interposition meant to return to them again and to re-enclose them in the sacred circle. By way of note, Abraham is clearly pointed out to be the father of nations, having himself come from the nations, Ur of the Chaldees, who believed God before he was circumcised, as Paul points out in Galatians. And so there's a coming full circle when there is the Gentile inclusion in the New Testament back to this original indication of God's purpose for all humanity. So, if anything, one might even say that the Jewish period is parenthetical to the church period. Although, of course, I'm not going to push that, but or at least not too very hard. It just being cheeky here, but a little jab at our Dispy brothers. Continuing. 3, the division of tongues. Chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. The building of a city and tower was inspired first by the desire to obtain a center of unity such as would keep the human race together. But the securing of this unity was by no means the ultimate purpose of the effort. Unity was to afford the possibility for founding a gigantic empire, glorifying man and his independence of God. The latest criticism finds here two myths woven together, one describing the building of a tower for preserving unity, the other relating to the building of a city for gaining renown. But this, while resembling the explanation just given, misses the interconnection between the two projects. The tower was for the sake of the city, and there is no need of dissection. God interferes with the execution of this plan, not so much, or at least not only, from opposition to its impious spirit, but chiefly from fidelity to his promise that the sinful development of humanity will not again issue into a repeated catastrophe on the scale of the deluge. If this were not to happen, the progress of sin had to be checked. If the whole of humanity had remained concentrated, the power of sin would likewise have remained united and doubtless soon again have reached stupendous proportions. Hence, it was next necessary to break up the unity of the race. As Delitzsch has observed, quote, the immoral and irreligious products of one nation are not equally destructive as those of an undivided humanity. And, quote, many false religions are better than one, since they paralyze one another, unquote. And by way of observation, I think that this divine economy, this administration of humanity so as to keep up certain divisions and multiplicity, pushes back at least a radical, thoroughgoing conspiratorialism that God Himself, in the creation of tongues and the divergence of humanity at Babel, is superintending all of this so that there is not the coalescence and the embodiment of evil in one point, so that the purpose of redemption can continue. Otherwise, it's just going to blow up right again. And so we see God's superintendence and governance of all nations, scattering, separating, dividing them for the peace and the well-being of the earth, or at least relatively so, so that redemption can proceed without yet another cataclysmic judgment. Continuing. It is true that in the abstract, the unity of the race, unbroken by national distinctions, is the ideal. Had not sin entered, this would undoubtedly have been the actual state of things, as it will become so in the final eschatological dispensation. And also, the church, as the kingdom of God, there is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free. But as the kingdom, that's not yet absolute. Kingdom come follows kingdom of grace. But for the present intervening period, this is not the will of God. Nationalism within proper limits has the divine sanction. An imperialism that would, in the interest of one people, obliterate all lines of distinction is everywhere condemned as contrary to the divine will. Later prophecy raises its voice against the attempt at world power, and that not only, as is sometimes assumed, because it threatens Israel, but for the far more principal reason that the whole idea is pagan and immoral. Uh, a comment, it's pagan and immoral, the impulse that we see in the building of Babel, that man will save himself. Man will uh, give himself a name, glorify himself, and he will do it by the arm of flesh. Now, it is through maintaining the national diversities as these express themselves in the difference of language and are in turn upheld by this difference that God prevents realization of the attempted scheme. Besides this, however, a twofold positive divine purpose may be discerned in this occurrence. In the first place, there was a positive intent that concerned the natural life of humanity. Under the providence of God, each race or nation has a positive purpose to serve, fulfillment of which depends on relative seclusion from others. And secondly, the events at this stage were closely interwoven with the carrying out of the plan of redemption. They led to the election and separate training of one race and one people. Election from its very nature presupposes the existence of a larger number from among which the choice can be made. 4. The election of the Shemites to furnish the bearers of redemption and revelation. Here the question must be raised. Was there any inherent fitness in the Shemites to serve this task? The answer is in the affirmative. Two traits come under consideration, the one belonging to the sphere of psychology, the other to the sphere of religious endowment. In connection with the former, the following may be noted. The Shemites have a predominantly passive, receptive, rather than active or productive mentality. At first, this temperament may have been universally human, as best suited to a primitive stage of knowledge, but at this point where humanity separates into its great branches and the racial dispositions become diversified, it seems to have been particularly inherited and cultivated among the Shemites. The form thus originally assumed by the truth secured the possibility of its translation into the mental world of other groups of the race. It is true, we as non-Shemites experience considerable difficulty in understanding the Old Testament scriptures, but much greater would have been the difficulties of the Hebrew mind in apprehending a revelation given in Greek forms of thought. At the same time, the Shemites must have possessed this mental predisposition in a moderate degree. The ease with which the Arabs and Jews have assimilated the Indo-Germanic type of civilization and the large contribution made by them to the progress of scientific and philosophic thought prove that they carry within them a twofold capacity, that of receiving the truth in its concrete shape and that of translating it into other abstract forms of apprehension. In connection with the antecedent religious endowment, the following points may be noted. A. The French writer Renan has at one time endeavored to reduce this religious endowment to a psychological one. Observing that the three great monotheistic religions have sprung up on Shemitic soil, he set up the hypothesis of a monotheistic instinct as characteristic of this racial group. Renan did not look upon this instinct as superior, but felt inclined to connect it with a lack of imaginative power. At the present day, this theory is entirely discredited. In the prevailing school of criticism, a widely different explanation of the origin of monotheism is current. It arose at a comparatively late point in the history of Israel, that is, in the period of the prophets, from about 800 to 600 BC. The manner of its origin was thus. These prophets had begun to perceive that Jehovah was supremely ethical in his character, which perception was a result of the prospect that the national and religious existence of Israel was about to be sacrificed to the principle of retributive righteousness. Eliminating the element of national favoritism, race, from the conception of God, and retaining as its content only the idea of strict justice, they were led to perceive, since the core of Jehovah's deity lay in this, that the gods of the heathen who lacked this qualification were not truly gods, which perception practically amounted to monotheism, although it took a considerable time for this germinal idea to assume shape and to ripen. Okay, I'm just processing this myself. So, this critical claim would be that with the rise of ethical monotheism, that there's no special favoritism, um, which would seem to be a principle of corruption, as opposed to justice, merit, that there is merit for why God um, treats a certain people well or not well. I think that's what he's saying. So the principle of grace is basically like the principle of favoritism. You know, you're my son, so I'm gonna turn a blind eye at this. You know, nepotism, things like that. But apart from these totally different constructions of the critical school, Renan's hypothesis breaks down before the fact that numerous groups of Shemites appear far from monotheistic at the time when instinct certainly should have made some approach towards the end in view. Edomites and Moabites were Shemites of as pure stock as the Hebrews, yet neither of them became monotheistic in the time they lie open to our observation in the Old Testament. Passing on from the nearer kinsmen of Israel to the remoter Assyrians, we find them possessed of a rich civilization, but nonetheless given over to a most luxuriant type of polytheism. The Arabs, to be sure, became in the end fanatical monotheists, but they had borrowed their monotheism from the Jews and the Christians. Nor is this all. The children of Israel themselves continued for a long time to feel the attractions of polytheism after they had long enough known monotheism on the critical view to have become thoroughly imbued with it. Jeremiah complains, chapter 2, 9 to 11, that Israel is more inclined to change its God than the heathen nations. It is not difficult to explain this. The pagan nations had no desire to change because their religion was the natural expression of their disposition. Israel persistently struggled to throw off the yoke of Jehovah's service because the old pagan nature of Israel felt it as a yoke. From the standpoint that the Shemites had an instinct for monotheism, all this becomes entirely unexplainable. B. After all this has been taken into account, it should nonetheless be noted that there appears among the smaller groups a certain uniformity of religion. All the deities, however great their number, are more or less modifications of the same fundamental conception. This may be readily seen from the synonymy of the names of the deities. And these names are found with slight variations of form among all the Shemitic tribes. C. Significant in this connection is also the element that seems to lie uppermost in the Shemitic religious consciousness. This is the element of submission. Compare the word Islam, meaning this very thing. This is, of course, an idea that is essential to all religion, but it is not everywhere developed with equal strength. Without it, religion can never become the supreme factor in the life of the religious subject, which it must be in order to act as a great historic force. The Shemites have become leaders in the world of religion because religion was the leading factor in their life, no matter whether for good or for evil. D. Still another feature worth considering here is what has been called tribal particularism. By this is meant the worship of one God by some particular tribe and tribal relations. It does not exclude belief in the existence or right to worship of other gods in other circles, or even in the same circle in other relationships. This is not monotheism, of course, but it is a pronounced form of tribal monolatry. So, monolatry being the worship of one, not strictly the existence only of one. So there is one among the pantheon that I worship. That's monolatry. E. These peculiarities of Shemitic religion stand as at the furthest remove from every pantheizing form of a tendency towards unification elsewhere observed, and on the surface seemingly like it. Great emphasis is placed upon the personal character of the relationship between the god and his worshiper. The same for the Shemitic religious subject is Eved, servant, and an intensely practical personal name it is. Personal devotion to the deity is the keynote of this service. Negatively, the same thing reveals itself in the careful distinction upheld between God and nature. The exaltation above nature of the deity, that which is called in religious terminology the holiness of the gods, well, to be distinguished from ethical holiness, is an outstanding trait. Where thus the transcendent power and majesty of the deity is felt, the temptation is much lessened to confound God with the world or draw him down into the realm of nature or matter. So, by way of comment here, he's making a distinction of two kinds of holiness. There's, one might say, ontological holiness and then ethical holiness. Ontological is that the gods, if we're speaking very broadly, comparative religion in the world, the ancient Near East, and of course the one true religion, there's a radical distinction. The more that ontological holiness is stressed, he is transcendent. He is in a wholly other category. And the more that is stressed, the more difficult it is to confound God and nature. Whereas ethical holiness is the, of course, as it sounds, it's the moral purity that is in view. Ordinary pantheistic monism, monism being everything is one, may easily tend in precisely the opposite direction. The unity holding the individual gods together may become nothing but the impersonal life of nature. Here, monism and polytheism are not only reconcilable, but mutually promotive of each other. Drawing down the deity into the processes of nature leads to the introduction of sex into the life of the divine. So begin collapsing that distinction in a more pantheizing direction, and the bridge between bringing the sensuality of creation into the divine is established. From this results a theogony or theogony, the creation, begetting of gods, and the consequent multiplication of gods. There seems reason to believe that wherever such traits appear in Shemitic religion, they are not an ancient Shemitic inheritance, but the result of corrupting influences introduced from without. In Arabia, where the Shemitic tribes lived most secluded, such features were even at the time of Muhammad exceedingly rare. We learn in the records of the time of 3 goddesses only, and these were not brought into sexual relations with the male gods. In the mind of Israel, there always remained a consciousness that the grosser, sensual elements of idolatry were foreign, not only to the legitimate religion of Jehovah, but to the ancient Shemitic inheritance. Uh, Observing here, again, notice right now Voss is dealing more generally than the true religion of Jehovah, but he's speaking of all of the kind of common class of Shemitic religions. And I wonder if this is in the background of what we encounter, like with Laban, um, Uh, well, certainly that would be one example, or the Midianites, Jethro or Hobab, the priest of Midian, or even Job himself, um, who it's not clear that he, if he, whether before the time of Abraham or contemporaneous, whatever, he seems to be detached from it. So there was maybe a broader domain, that there was a lesser degree of corruption within the Shemitic peoples, maybe a pure revelation from Noah stepping off the ark, the religion there, um, which would make sense. Um, if it's the Shemitic line that within it, where the true religion continues and is maintained, then those kind of in the secondary periphery, one might say, there's common overlap. Uh, Maybe like the Samaritans vis-a-vis the Jews. Okay, F. Finally, we must observe that such religious race dispositions were not self-produced through evolution, on the one hand, nor sufficient of themselves on the principle of evolution to produce the higher religion of the Old Testament. It is plain that the traits on which we have dwelt lie rather on the line of a downward than of an upward movement. By way of comment, even within the Shemitic line, there is decline and there is, shall we say, religious entropy, while God maintains the line, the holy line. Even the Hebrews in Egypt were corrupted um, to some degree, as Ezekiel, I believe, bears witness that there was a negative influence of the Egyptian religion upon the sons of Abraham in Egypt. Continuing. Outside of Israel, we find them in historic times not on the increase, but decidedly on the decrease. Within Israel itself, we can trace the downward shift of this natural Shemitic faith, not merely in the struggle with alien influences, but also in a gradual internal decline. Uh, those are those are to be distinguished. There's related, to be sure, but external temptation and corruption, as well as internal decline and degradation. Continuing. What existed and continued to keep alive was the remnant of a purer knowledge of God, preserved from extinction by God Himself. There is further to be distinguished in the Bible a threefold significance of the term name and its religious connections. First, it may express one divine characteristic. That which we call an attribute, the Old Testament calls a name of God. Such an adjectival designation may easily pass over into a proper name. God is holy. That is his name. But it becomes a nomen proprium when the prophet speaks of him as the Holy One of Israel. Next, the name of God can stand abstractly and comprehensively for all that God has revealed concerning himself. This is the name of God. In this sense, it is simply equivalent to revelation, not, of course, as an act, but as a product. This use applies to both general and special revelation. God's name is glorious in all the earth. The pious trust in the name of God, they make it a high tower. In the third place, the name of God comes to stand realistically for God himself. The name is equivalent to God in theophany. Of this we shall speak later. The name El is probably derived from the root ul, meaning to be strong. So El first meant strength, then the strong one. Another etymology makes El come from Allah, to precede, which would yield leader or commander. According to still others, El is from the same root as the preposition El. It would then signify the one who stretches himself out towards things, or the one to whom others go out for help. This, however, is rather too abstract. When explaining that it signifies power, we should be careful to take power in the dynamic sense, because another name seems to express the element of authority. Originally, ale must have been in frequent use. It still occurs as an appellative in the phrase, "It is the ale power of my hand," Genesis 31:29, and so on. Gradually, ale was supplanted by Elohim. In some of the later writings of the Old Testament, it does not occur at all. In the Song of Moses, Exodus 15, it is used several times. The latter period employed it chiefly in poetry. It also continued to be used in theophoric names, or poetic designations of God. El occurs in the Old Testament somewhat more than 200 times. The derivation of Elohim is uncertain. It may come from a Shemitic root with the basic meaning of to fear, to be perplexed, and so to seek refuge. From that, there is but one step to the notion dread, and this would be objectified in the sense of the one to be dreaded, or the one to whom one comes in fear or dread. A rather novel theory is based on the observation that El has no plural and Elohim no singular, so that Elohim is considered the regular plural formation of El. There is, however, another singular to Elohim, that is Eloah, which, to be sure, occurs only in poetic writings and may therefore be an artificial form to supply the lacking singular. Some critics consider this plural a remnant of polytheistic usage, going back to a period in which the people knew many divinities, not only one God. Against this tells the fact that Elohim occurs only among the Hebrews, and such a plural form for a single deity is not found among other Shemitic tribes. Israel, being the only Shemitic nation that developed monotheism, would scarcely have, alone of all others, retained such a trace of original polytheism. Elohim is simply a plural expressing majesty, magnitude, fullness, richness. Probably God was named Elohim because the fullness of his might extended in every direction. The plural need have no more polytheistic flavor than the Greek word theotes, feminine, proves all original Greek deities to have been females. Elohim is not used in theophoric names. The Hebrew sometimes has to use it as a true numerical plural, for example, when speaking of pagan gods. In such a case, however, it is always construed with the plural verb, whereas in a case of reference to the true God, it takes a singular verb. The name Elohim occurs in the Old Testament more than 2,500 times.